If you watch the news coverage of a failed attempt to overthrow the government of Bolivia, soldiers filling the capital's main square, armored vehicles ramming presidential palace gates, it was all very dramatic. You'll notice a classic hedge that so many of us in the media use.
Armored vehicles and soldiers have withdrawn from outside Bolivia's presidential palace following what appears to be a failed coup attempt.
A military coup appears to be underway.
After what appeared to be an attempted military coup.
What appears to be an attempted coup d'etat.
Yes, it appeared to be an attempted military coup. We use that kind of language when we can't fully explain what we're looking at with our own eyes, because a lot of it didn't make sense. For starters, it was the shortest coup attempt I've ever seen. In with a bang, out with a whimper.
After about 4 hours, the soldiers withdrew from the main square.
And why did it end so quickly? Because the general who appeared to be leading the charge, he didn't appear to have any meaningful political support from anyone. The whole thing fizzled fast. Then there was a claim to reporters that the whole thing had been staged. I'll read straight from the Associated Press. Before his arrest late Wednesday, Zuniga, that's the general involved, alleged without providing evidence that the president, Arce, himself had ordered the general to carry out the coup attempt in a ruse to boost the president's popularity. And it goes on to raise the possibility that this was a self-coup.
Now, of course, the speculation is going to center on who was behind this. Was it the president who was staging a coup, right, a self-coup, or were there others?
Like I said, none of it makes sense, except a lot of it did. Bolivia is a country in crisis right now. Its economy is floundering. Its political institutions are paralyzed, and its future is messy. So, what's going on with Bolivia? I'll say right now, there aren't a ton of truly satisfying answers to the question, what the heck actually happened here? But we can try to piece it together and line up what does make sense with what doesn't. Starting with the moment soldiers stormed the Plaza Murillo. On Wednesday, armed soldiers, armored vehicles, they physically occupy the main square of the capital, La Paz. They take it over. One of the men ultimately held responsible for the coup, General Juan Jose Zuniga, would tell reporters that he vowed to restore democracy. He also tells them he intends to replace cabinet and free political prisoners. Exactly the kind of thing you'd expect to hear from someone staging a coup.
Zuniga called for the liberation of political prisoners. There are over 300 political prisoners in Bolivia, right? But among the political prisoners that he calls for their liberation is former President Áñez and a former presidential candidate, Camacho, both of whom are in maximum security prisons.
At some point, the world witnesses this escalation, an armored vehicle literally driving into a palace gate. What followed was a series of desperate moves unfolding in real time. A video message from the president, flanked by his most senior officials, denouncing the attempt to overthrow him and calling on his supporters to resist.
In Latin America, it's a very common thing. You know, you tell anybody who works for the government to go out and protest in favor of whatever you want. The reality is that the government mobilized people, right? Probably well in advance. This is not a spontaneous group of people that showed up at the plaza.
President Luis Arce refuses to relent, and while this was all happening, he names a whole slate of new military commanders to replace those that he believes are disloyal. And they give the order to the soldiers in the square, stand down. And they do.
An attempt to overthrow Bolivia's democratically elected government has been stopped.
But then a twist. Just before security forces restore order and arrest the general seemingly in charge of this revolt, he claims the whole thing was set up by the president himself. The president told me the situation is very screwed up, very critical. It is necessary to prepare something to raise my popularity. As in, and this is just me gaming this out, let's pretend You, my general, you're staging a coup. I, as president, will forcefully stop you in your tracks, and the people will celebrate?
The army seemed to be very united yesterday, and the armed forces generally. And I think that's very unusual. Historically, in coup d'etats in Latin America, they're very messy. They involve a lot of divisions within the armed forces, the police, the army, the navy, etc. We didn't see any of that yesterday. I think there's a good chance that, in fact, this might have been a staged event.
You might say this guy is nuts. He's crazy, right? And that can be a great excuse. The guy is insane, and therefore he launched this coup. But I think the narrative that's going to prevail is the narrative of a broader conspiracy headed by the opposition with the support of the political right.
If true, it is an incredible claim, but one that the country's justice minister very swiftly denied. He says it's a lie, and that Zuniga could face up to 20 years in prison for what he's done. The country's defense minister also told reporters Zuniga was recently dismissed from his post, fired, less than a day before he rolled up to the palace gates, flanked by soldiers and armored personnel carriers storming the presidency. It all makes for a very complicated series of events, made even more complex by the backdrop all of this was set against. In some ways, the coup attempt wasn't so surprising. For months, the government has been paralyzed by an internal feud. Two factions of the party at war with each other. One controlled by the president, the other controlled by the former president, Evo Morales.
Bolivia's Evo Morales has declared victory in the country's presidential election, giving him a third consecutive term.
He has been a towering figure in Bolivian politics, incredibly popular at different stages of his career. The country's first indigenous president, but forced to resign amid protests in 2019 after trying to seek a fourth term in power. He fled the country, but ultimately returned, staging a dramatic political comeback. And now he holds significant sway within the ruling party. His opinions matter, and there is a gaping rift between his vision of the future and that of the current president. He's even threatened to challenge him in elections next year, something that could spark a constitutional crisis.
The political crisis, which is largely rooted in the fact that Evo Morales, right, assumed in 2020, when he invited Arce to be the presidential candidate, that Arce would simply be a placeholder, right? And that 5 years later, when the new round of elections came, 2025, that Arce would step aside. But Arce believes that he has the constitutional right to be reelected. And the feud has largely been one in which both have been fighting over the name of the party, the movement towards socialism.
Bolivia has also gone through incredible economic upheaval. Natural gas exports have plummeted over the years. That's a critical industry for the country, and Bolivia is one of the most resource-dependent countries in Latin America. Its foreign currency reserves are also dwindling, meaning it's running out of US dollars, which limits how well it can weather economic shocks.
Bolivia is going through a very serious political and economic crisis. Bolivia now has no export market, and Bolivia's wealth came from exporting natural gas to Argentina and to Brazil. So Bolivia is stuck now not having an export base and a government with a president who claimed credit for that model, right, who now finds himself unable to respond to that crisis.
There's a deficit of dollars, so that's very difficult for people who want to import things. And so people are seeing that in the next few years, the economic situation is going to get worse.
In the last 200 or so years since Bolivia declared its independence, it has experienced nearly as many coups. At some points in its history, it's experienced several in a single calendar year. And in this specific way, it's gone through more political turmoil than any other country on earth. But this attempt was different.
I was extraordinarily surprised by the way in which it was conducted. What motivates a guy to storm the palace, but not fire a single shot. Essentially runs into the palace, goes up to the president with machine guns, and doesn't take power.
I lived through military coups in the 1970s and 80s in Bolivia, and those are very, very bloody, very, very chaotic. It just stands in such a clear, sort of distinction, so different from previous coup attempts or coups that I did not think this was a real situation.
What's more, this most recent coup attempt, even opposition leaders were quick to condemn it. Nobody seemed to want any part of it, so it ended quickly. But whatever explains the events of this week, was it a terrible miscalculation, a spontaneous expression of anger, or a staged event meant to bolster an unpopular president? We know this much. Bolivia's democracy is fragile.
If you scratch the surface, you're going to see a lot of intervention by the executive in all these other branches, and I think that really undermines democracy and the Republican Constitution of Bolivia.
There may not be lasting physical damage to the country's government. The palace gates can be fixed, the square can be cleaned up, but Bolivia's democratic institutions are weaker now than before, and that weakness has been exposed for the world to see in short-lived but spectacular fashion.